And so it is my pleasure today to introduce 4 amazing people who have made it their life mission to preserve and promote the use of high quality, what I call healthy water in this very arid region of the world. Clearly, it is easy to see that this very limited resource could be a source of major international conflict. And yet our speakers have demonstrated to all of us that water can be used as a tool for collaboration and ultimately for building peace rather than having conflict. So their efforts should be inspiring to all of us. Our first speaker is Dr. Clive Lipchin, who serves as a director of the Arava Institute Center for Transboundary Water Management. And here is where he oversees the research and different projects that you will be hearing about today that focus on these transboundary water and environmental problems facing Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinian Authority. Dr. Lipchin is, to be honest, has too many accomplishments that I don't have time to be discussing here and presenting to you today. So Clive, I apologize for not giving an extensive CV from you, but the most salient aspects of his work include doing research for a number of international water agencies, such as the World Bank, European Union, and USAID. Recently, his research has focused on cross-border stream restoration and water management issues between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, and has worked on integrating food, energy, and water systems for off-grid communities, both in the Middle East and also in countries of the developing world. Dr. Lipchin is a native from South Africa, and he has been living in Israel already for over more than 20 years. So that's our first speaker. And the second speaker today is Younes Rjoub. He is an alum of the Arava Institute. He received his master's in environmental studies from Tel Aviv University. And I also hear that he's an expert on GIS. He is currently working alongside with Dr. Lipchin in the transboundary projects related to wastewater, that's a mouthful, wastewater in Al-Auja, I hope I'm not killing that pronunciation, in the West Bank, and wastewater pollution in the Hebron River. He's also collaborating with Farid in monitoring COVID-19 in wastewaters. And again, there's gonna be some presentation on that as well at the end of the session today. Our third speaker is Olivia Nordland. She is a recent graduate of Tel Aviv University Environmental Studies Master's Program. Her thesis topic tackled industrial chromium pollution in the Hebron stream, which is a transboundary watercourse that travels through the West Bank, Israel, and Gaza. And so clearly this chromium pollution is affecting many, many people. She was born in the United States, but is currently living in Tel Aviv. And last but not least, this is an awesome panel. You will hear from our colleague Farid, who all of you already know. He is not only a co-founder of this seminar series, but he's also an environmental educator and an activist. Farid is a biomedical engineer and a graduate of the Haifa University School of Public Health, where he earned his master's in environmental and occupational public health hygiene. He's also an alumni of the Arava Institute and specializes in promoting environmental public health. He is involved in several transboundary projects, including the testing of water for COVID-19. So he's gonna teach us all about that. Farid right now is originally from El Fahem and currently lives in Omer, which is near to Beersheba. So with these very short introductions, I would like to have now Clive, please take this on. And we are looking forward to learning all about water in the Middle East. Thanks to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky, and thank you to everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. And thanks to all the others that are on this panel, to Olivia, and to Younes, and to Farid. So I'm gonna start off by giving an overview of the transboundary water resources in Israel, Jordan, and Palestine. And the purpose is to set the context for the projects that you're going to hear in more detail from the others on the panel. And I will briefly introduce each of the projects. So you can then they will all go into those projects in more detail. So we shall get started. Let me just share my screen. Okay, so hopefully everybody is seeing the screen. Okay, so when we're talking about this part of the Middle East, again, Jordan and Palestine, we're talking about an arid part of the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East, where natural water resources are scarce, and the pressure on those resources are growing primarily due to increasing population growth in all the countries, but also being exacerbated by climate change, which is impacting the long-term supply of water. So water scarcity or water stress is a reality in our region. And an additional aspect to this issue of scarcity and stress is the extremely transboundary nature of these water resources. So we are dealing with a number of challenges when it comes to water. The amount of water that we have is relatively small to meet the needs of the growing population, and climate change is only going to make things more challenging. So to begin by introducing what are the sources of water for this region, there are three major sources. We only have one significant surface water system, which is on the map on the right side of the map of the slide, excuse me, which is the Jordan River system. And the Jordan River system is heavily utilized by Israel and Jordan, primarily in the upper watershed, which is the Kinneret or the Sea of Galilee, which is the lake up here. And this lake is managed as a reservoir by Israel, pumping the water from the north of the country all the way down to the south via an extensive nationally managed water network. The initial usage of this water was for agriculture, for the development of irrigation in the Negev region, which is the arid southern region of Israel. And since the signing of the peace treaty with Jordan in 1994, Jordan and Israel actually share the waters from this system. The other two main sources of water in our region, and actually the most critical source of water in our region, is groundwater. And so pumping of groundwater is a major aspect to water management for all the countries of the region. And managing pumping rates with recharge from rainfall is challenging, given again the increasing demand and the diminishing supplies. So our groundwaters are very delicate, if I could use that word, in terms of their long-term sustainability for a number of reasons. In the center of the slide, you can see here the extent of what we call the mountain aquifer system, which underlies most of the recharge of the mountain aquifer is in the territory of the West Bank, within the Palestinian territories. The flow of water can go either westwards towards the Mediterranean, which constitutes the Western Aquifer system, or eastwards to the Jordan River and Dead Sea, which constitutes the Eastern Aquifer. And then we have a smaller aquifer flowing northeast as well. Groundwater is essentially the only source of water accessible to the Palestinian Authority. So they're heavily dependent on groundwater as the only source of water that is accessible to them. And these issues of accessibility with respect to the Palestinian Authority were negotiated between Israel and the Palestinian Oslo Accords. And then we have along the Mediterranean coast, all the way into Gaza, a resource that was heavily utilized by Israel even prior to the establishment of the state as the source of water that was tapped to provide for the going all the way back to the 1920s. The coastal aquifer is the only source of water that is available to the Palestinians of Gaza. And the coastal aquifer is heavily overpumped in Gaza. And the outcome of this overpumping is seawater intrusion. So the residents of the Gaza Strip face a water quality issue in terms of high salinity in their drinking water, and also water for other purposes like agriculture. The challenge for the mountain aquifer system, both the western aquifer, is pollution, and this actually relates to some of the projects that the others will be speaking about. This just gives you a bit of sense of where the water is, and also the transboundary nature of the water. So as I mentioned, the Jordan River system, and here you see the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, and the Dead Sea. These are the three main elements of the system. It's a transboundary system that actually constitutes both Syria and Lebanon in the north, because two of the sources of waters to the Jordan River originate in Syria and in Lebanon. So Syria and Lebanon also have transboundary linkages to the system. Then we have Israel and Jordan and the Palestinian Authority, specifically the area of the West Bank. The area that you see there in red is the mountain aquifer, which you can see the majority of the recharge area is within the West Bank. So a major issue between Israelis and Palestinians is on groundwater management in the West Bank. And then you can see the extent of the coastal aquifer and the fact that this is the only source of water accessible to the Palestinians of Gaza. This gives you a sense of the extent of transboundary groundwater resources, which goes slightly beyond what I just said. We have here the Azraq aquifer, which is a very important source of water for Jordan that actually originates in Syria. We have the DC aquifer in the south, which is a very important source of water for Jordan and also Saudi Arabia. And what is interesting about DC is this is a non-renewable or fossil aquifer, meaning that there's no recharge. So any extraction of water from the DC aquifer actually constitutes a gradual draining of this aquifer. We have in the Arava region shared aquifers between Jordan and Israel, and these aquifer systems are heavily utilized for agricultural usage for both Israel and Jordan, primarily date production. Then the mountain aquifer, which I mentioned earlier, is a very important source of water for Israel and the Palestinians of the West Bank. And we have a deep western Nubian sandstone aquifer, which actually extends into Sinai, so incorporating Egypt. This is an aquifer that at the moment is not heavily utilized, mostly because of the complex hydrogeology of the system, but it is a potential source of water in the future. And finally, we have the coastal aquifer, as I mentioned, exploited by Israel and the Palestinians of the Gaza Strip. Okay, what you see here are the transboundary watersheds flowing from the eastern areas in the West Bank across into Israel. So in addition to what we just saw, there are a number of smaller watersheds that are considered to be perennial or seasonal watersheds. In other words, these are systems where water is mostly found only in the winter rainy season, but they're also transboundary and requires some level of coordination between Israel and the Palestinians, primarily because the headwaters of these systems all originate in the West Bank, making the Palestinians upstream to this source of water and the Israelis downstream. Part of our work at the Arava Institute is looking at these cross-border watersheds, primarily again in terms of the issue of pollution, mostly that being untreated wastewater flowing from the Palestinian areas through these systems and then crossing into Israel. So one of the main areas that we work on at the Arava Institute is transboundary wastewater management between Israel and Palestine. And Younes and Olivia and Farid can all go into this in a bit more detail with respect to their individual projects. This is a map that shows you the complexity of some of the watersheds. This is a watershed that we're heavily involved in. And all of us are working in this area. This is the Hebron Basalt watershed, where what you can see here is diversity in wastewater treatment areas or the Israeli area. And we also have within the area of Israel, two types of Bedouin communities, settled Bedouin in the yellow, Bedouin towns, and then unsettled or unrecognized Bedouin communities that are highlighted in orange and also in red. And all of these different communities have different access to both water and wastewater infrastructure. So a big part of our work at the Arab Institute is to try to map out these different types of communities in terms of their connection to infrastructure for water, wastewater, and also for energy, and what their needs are in terms of having their basic water and wastewater needs met, and to try to present all of this from a watershed-based approach. In other words, to engage all of the stakeholders within the watershed, whether they be Israeli, Palestinian, or Bedouin, to find a way in which all can work together for the best management practices for the watershed as one hydrological unit, irrespective of the fact that we've got a lot of politics at play here, specifically between Israel, which makes up most of the watershed, but the source of the water originates, in this case, in the southern West Bank, and therefore, of course, the Palestinians are very, very important in how this system is managed. Here is just one example of some of the problems. This actually is another watershed in the northern part of the West Bank, in the northeastern aquifer, and here you can see different concentrations of nitrates in the aquifer, both on the Palestinian side and on the Israeli side. The light blue arrows is showing you the flow of groundwater. So pollution on the Palestinian side is flowing across the green line, which is the border separating Israel and the West Bank into Israel. And it's very difficult to manage the source of these nitrate concentrations because they're primarily non-point source pollution from agriculture, from fertilizer and pesticide use. So again, what you see here is a cross-border issue of nitrate pollution, which is impacting the water quality of the aquifer, which is an essential source of water for both Israelis and Palestinians. So this is just an example of some of the complexities that we're dealing with in terms of how to manage a transboundary aquifer, in this case, in terms of pollution infiltration into the aquifer. This is a picture that relates mostly to Olivia's work, where we see here untreated wastewater flowing in the environment due to the lack of wastewater treatment within the West Bank, and the connection of untreated wastewater pollution, the environment and public health, specifically the potential uptake of pollutions within the water into animals that are then slaughtered and eaten. And so we have an epidemiological aspect to our work, and I'll leave it for Olivia to expand on this. Another big problem that we face is due to the lack of infrastructure in the Palestinian regions and also within the Bedouin communities in the Negev. People rely on very unsanitary cesspits to discharge their sewage, as you can see in these pictures. And those cesspits basically drain the sewage with no treatment into the aquifer. So we have long-term pollution of the aquifer. But again, there are public health hazards here as well. And both Younes and Farid can relate to this work as well. Younes in terms of better planning for resolving the reliance on cesspits, and Younes in terms of, again, the public health hazards, specifically the issue of COVID-19 virus in these wastewater systems. This relates to Younes's work. We work with Palestinian NGOs and colleagues and partners in the West Bank to introduce what we term off-grid or decentralized systems for wastewater treatment due to the lack of access of centralized sewer networks in the Palestinian territories. So Younes has been working on developing a master plan on how to introduce decentralized systems in one of the areas we work in called Al Ujra village in the Jordan Valley. And I will have Younes expand on that. And finally, just one or two slides on the work that we're doing in COVID-19, which Fareed will expand on. This is a growing area of work around the world, what is being termed wastewater epidemiology. The idea is that we can sample for the coronavirus in sewage as a means to pre-screen or predict where future infections will occur. So this slide just shows you a study that was done by colleagues at Yale University in Boston, showing you the strong correlation between wastewater, the concentration of the virus in wastewater, and that picked up within the population due to direct testing by the health ministry. And you can see that the concentrations in the wastewater predate that of the new cases. So we see a strong correlation between the concentration of the virus in sewage and what we then see anywhere from a week to 2 weeks later in terms of infection in the population being served by the sewer networks in which the coronavirus is being discharged. So this is some of our work on the Israeli side, working within the Palestinian community, sampling wastewater systems like this one, sewer networks like this one for the coronavirus. And then this is a summary of some of our results. And you can see here again in the blue, the concentration of the virus in wastewater. And then the green line is the active cases that were identified by the health ministry. And you can see again that we are able to determine before cases actually rise, the concentration of the virus in the wastewater. And here's another example as well. But again, I'll let Fareed expand on this in his presentation. And if I'm not mistaken, that's my final slide. So thanks very much for the attention. I'll turn it back over to the moderator, and I'll be available later on for some Q&A on my presentation. Thank you. So I will stop the share at this point. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Clive. We really appreciate it. So with that nice introduction, then I would like then to ask Olivia if you can, no, sorry, Younes. Younes is first. So Younes, if you don't mind, please sharing your presentation with all of us. Thank you. Younes, you need to unmute yourself.
Hi guys, I want to talk about the master plan of wastewater in Al-Oja and Jericho, and in this presentation, I will talk about the water crisis in West Bank and what the major problem in Al-Oja village. Al-Oja village, I will present it by map. It is located in West Bank, and in the right side, Al-Oja, and I will speak about the Oslo Agreement first, because it is more important about my study to introduce about the classify about the land of agreement of Oslo Agreement in 1995. We have the green line. We have the area A, around 80%, and natural reserve around 30%. And we have area B, 19%, and area C, 16%. And my research objectives The main objectives in the research are setting the beginning towards of the municipality, local concerns, GIS department at Al-Oja village through creating wastewater master plan. It helped GIS department in the municipality of Al-Oja to develop the master plan and to enhance the improvements of the environmental impact at Al-Oja village through minimizing the flow wastewater and particularly on the quality of groundwater stream and words to improve the hygiene and health environment through reducing the spread of wastewater pathogens like Escherichia coli and bacteria. Our study area in Al-Oja village, I will give you an introduction about it. Al-Oja village is a community, Palestinian community village located in Jericho district in the eastern part of West Bank, and it is situated 230 meters below sea level and far away around 8 kilometers north of Jericho, according to the Palestinian Center Bureau of Statistics. In 2020, the total of population of Al-Oja was 5,570 capita. Total of the area around 166 square kilometer. According to the Oslo Agreement, we classify the area Area A and the Area C. Area A 16 square kilometer and Area C 19 square kilometer. The annual rainfall around 166 millimeter. Jordan Valley, it is classified under Jordan Valley as arid area. The environment assessment of wastewater in the village, pollution level assessment in the main water resources, detecting the heavy metal residents and other chemical polluting and the targeting village, inspection of disease pathogens, the organisms for raw wastewater, the adverse impact of raw wastewater on the soil fertility level, the impact of cis-based distribution at target village on the worldwide and biodiversity. The cis-based at target village usually constructed in a traditional way without any protection layers, potential of rain water pollution from cis-based discharge. We use method in my research by using GIS and correction data, and we use global position system and the area photo, and we are using our catalog and AutoCAD software and geodatabase and satellite image, and we we taking samples and analysis based on standard operating procedure to measure the quality of wastewater during the boundary and delineation the boundary of Al-Oja depends of the Oslo Agreement to area A and C, and I don't mention area B. Area B in other location in West Bank. The master plan it would be in the area B. In my research, I divided the area to 3 clusters, and finally the master plan of wastewater will be proposed in cluster 2 about 3 square kilometers. And I will show you the map. It will give you rich knowledge about it. We have the delineation, the area from area photo, depending the boundary of Palestinian Authority. We have area C, we have area A. Area C around 90 square kilometer, area A around 19, and we have, I divided it, cluster 1, cluster 2, cluster 3, and the red color is cluster 2, the study area, because all the residential area I studied it in area A, and we have delineation, the communities and the houses, and we also check the water vulnerability about high, moderate, not sensitive, because it is important for the pollution or any other influence of environment. And in this map, I show it to show you the flow direction of the water, where is come from up flow and down flow. And we have also get many wells and many and install of the system of anaerobic system in cluster 2. I will mention it later. And I move to other study. I use the NAND cover to delineation or to clarify which the agricultural use in this area, and I classify it, and we have catchment area around 53, and we have 6 beds around 919, and we have the elevation model, and we use it to study the elevation model and the wells and flow direction and the pollution where it will go. And we have houses around 864, and we have severing and wells, and we have also waste dumping random of the wadis in the Al Uja village, and we have two installed system in the area, in cluster 2 and the other in cluster 1. And we have also the sewer network, the sewer grid for grey water system purpose for irrigation. And we have the flow wastewater flow direction, stream and groundwater vulnerability. And we have the system of anaerobic gravity treatment below ground and aerobic with the charcoal above. We haven't much time to talk about it, but we install 4 systems in this area and to treat the water. And we have work schedule plan, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Phase 1 to correction the data to and to doing questionnaire, to doing questionnaire and to other thing and delineation the area. Master plan of Al Uja cover of the following, the boundary of Al Uja village and the network between houses and of the cluster, water flow direction, customer area, contour line, and the slope, water vulnerability, and aquifer, and we have the end use, we have land cover, we have groundwater wells, what is and the stream, Palestine, and aerial photo, and a purpose of and the goal to develop the master plan to establish a sewage network in order to prevent the environmental pollution, rehabilitation, Al Uja severing, providing a well for the irrigation, using agricultural land more variety, rehabilitation, concept correction. The important thing, the master plan proves how the village can develop according to consideration and zoning standards by accepting the area plan by considering the special model of the village and the development the basic of infrastructure of wastewater treatment by the system, conclusion and the recommendation. Advantage of the decentralized wastewater management approach as opposed to a centralized wastewater management approach for adults, because there is no sewage network, and decentralized or honest treatment is more feasible for the village and to prevent and reduce sanitation and environment hazard, and use to treat wastewater for irrigation, and raising our awareness for targeting group the benefit and safe use of treated wastewater for irrigation. And I have references. Thank you. And I haven't enough time to talk more about the project. Thank you.
Thank you, Younes. Thank you so much for your hard work in this area, and to hopefully be able to prevent more of this environmental pollution that's happening, and to hopefully improve the infrastructure. I think that will be very important, and your efforts are really very well received by everyone, I'm sure. So the next presenter, and again, a gentle reminder that if you have questions as we're going through the speakers today, just write them on the chat and we'll have a question and answer at the end of the session. So with that, I would like to now ask Olivia to please join us and share your presentation, which is going to have to do with the chromium contamination and pollution. Thank you, Olivia.
All right, thanks, Rebecca. All right, I hope everyone can see my screen. Let me just present.
Yes, it's there.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm going to talk briefly about the issue of chromium pollution in the Hebron stream, and specifically what I'm doing with my project to investigate this issue. So just an outline of what I'm going to talk about. First, I'll give you some context about the Hebron stream and the Hebron watershed. Then I'll talk about the chromium pollution problem in the stream and its impacts on the environment and human health in the area. Then I'll talk about my research project, sort of the goals and what we've done so far, current progress. And then I'll finish with some final thoughts about how I feel like my project connects to this wider issue of transboundary water and water management. So first, I'll talk about the Hebron stream. So the Hebron stream originates in the West Bank, near the city of Hebron, which is where it gets its name from. And it moves southwest through the West Bank and then crosses into Israel, and eventually passes through Beersheba, which you can see here on the map. And then eventually the Hebron stream merges with several others in the watershed, including the Basalt, and then together they all continue traveling through Israel through the Negev, which is Israel's major desert, and then eventually enter the Mediterranean Sea through the Gaza Strip. Now the stream is located in mostly arid to semi-arid microclimates. And so as a result, in its natural state, it only has seasonal flow during the winter rainy seasons. However, continual runoff from untreated wastewater in the West Bank, plus additional effluents from Israeli agriculture and municipalities, has resulted in a continuous flow in the stream throughout the year. What this means is that in the dry summer and fall months, almost all of the flow in the stream is a mix of industrial, municipal, and agricultural wastewaters. And so these areas on the banks of the stream are similar to the nature of the wastewater in the stream, are either urban areas, industrial zones, municipalities, and agriculture. Now, in terms of rainfall in the winter, in an average year during the rainy season, there are about 2 to 3 rainstorms that produce major flood events along the Hebron stream. And this can get up to a maximum of between 6 and 7 major flood events during a very wet winter. This is important because it means that in the wintertime, there is a high risk of polluted water in the stream overflowing onto the land surrounding it. And this creates a sanitation problem for municipal lands and urban lands, and also risk of contamination of potable groundwater resources in the area. And as Clive said, groundwater is a major resource that's relied on in the area where water scarcity is a severe threat. So contamination of groundwater is a very serious problem. In addition, this risk of flooding can result in deposits of harmful pathogens and chemical compounds onto agricultural crops, which also presents issues for that industry. So in terms of transboundary water management of the Hebron Stream, Clive mentioned that there's a large lack of wastewater infrastructure in the West Bank. Most Palestinian municipalities and industrial centers are not connected to a central wastewater network, and instead they rely on cesspits as a major solution to store sewage until it can be collected and treated. These cesspits are often unlined. Younes talked about this a little bit. And so often untreated or semi-treated wastewater in the cesspits can easily percolate into groundwater, and from there can eventually flow into the Hebron Stream. So these cesspits are a major source of wastewater entering the stream. In addition, wastewater that is collected from cesspits is often discharged untreated into wadis, which are basically valleys or springs, or other unused land in the West Bank. And so the wastewater can enter the stream in this way. So these methods of wastewater management in the West Bank can result in around 60 million cubic meters of wastewater being discharged into the environment in the West Bank each year. And so this wastewater, when it enters the stream, because the stream is transboundary, it will flow across the Green Line into Israel and then on through the rest of the stream. So the city of Hebron, as I mentioned, is the namesake of the river, and it's also a major population center and industrial center where lots of wastewater that ends up in the stream comes from. Industries that contribute wastewater include stone and marble cutting, leather tanning, and also olive oil production. And as I said before, this wastewater contains a number of organic and chemical pollutants that pose a risk to human health and the environment. Unfortunately, the wastewater management of the Hebron Stream is not very coordinated between Israel and the West Bank. And so each side tends to unilaterally deal with this longstanding problem. And the result is that ultimately the pollution remains improperly addressed. On the Israeli side, the Israeli law stipulates that the water in the Hebron Stream, because it is untreated wastewater, must be treated once it crosses the Green Line into Israel. But because of international peace treaties like the Oslo Accords, Israel is not entitled to use that wastewater once it's been treated. And so it just discharges the water back into the stream. The water from the stream is treated at the Shoket wastewater treatment plant, which you can see a picture of on the left. So these are just some pictures that I've taken during site visits to the stream, and just an example of the different types of effluents that you can see entering the stream. So the picture on the left includes some calcium carbonate deposits on the stream banks, along with water that is full of calcium carbonate as well. And this comes from the local stone cutting industry. And then on the right, you can see there's sort of like these bubbles on the top of the water, and that is oil sludge discharged from the olive oil industry. So now I'll talk about the problem of chromium pollution specifically. So chromium is a transition metal. It is a major element, and its name comes from the Greek chromos for color, and it's because when it is combined with other elements to create industrial compounds, they often have very bright and vibrant colors. You can see in this picture, this powder that's called chromium sulfate has this very bright, vibrant color, and this powder is actually a common reagent used in tanning industry, as you can see below. The important thing to know about chromium in the context of my research is that there are two main stable ionic forms of chromium, and that's chromium 3 and chromium 6. So basically, if you look at, if you look at this graphic right here, this is a model of a chromium atom, and basically chromium 3 and chromium 6 delineate how many of the electrons on the outside of the atom are lost. So in chromium-6, there are 6 less electrons on the atom, and then on chromium-3, there are 3 less electrons. So that is the only difference between the two, but this small difference has major ramifications for both the toxicity and the ability of the chromium to pollute the environment. So chromium-3 is actually an essential dietary element, and it's used by plants, animals, and also humans for important metabolic processes like protein synthesis. Chromium-6, on the other hand, is toxic and carcinogenic due to the byproducts that are formed when our bodies try to detoxify chromium-6. Now, chromium-6 and chromium-3 can be very easily interchanged through chemical reactions. You can turn one into the other. And this is another important thing to understand in terms of my research and the threat that chromium pollution poses. Chromium is used in a number of industries for a number of purposes, including leather tanning, metal finishing, wood preserving, and textile pigments. So as I said, chromium sulfate is a common tanning reagent, and usually it uses chromium-3. In the past, chromium-6 was commonly used to form this reagent, but because of its toxicity, modern tanning industries prefer to use chromium-3 now. However, if the reagent is improperly produced or if it's improperly handled, sometimes the chromium-3 can turn into chromium-6 and thus is more toxic and harmful. As a result of the high use of chromium sulfate in tanning, obviously there are high levels of chromium in wastewater from tanneries. And so the issue here is because chromium-3 and chromium-6 can easily be switched around and turned into each other, when the wastewater from tanneries mixes with other effluents that contain pollutants and other chemical compounds from industrial waste, there's a possibility that chromium-3 can be oxidized to chromium-6. Manganese oxide is a common component of agricultural fertilizers, and this actually has the ability to transform chromium-3 into chromium-6. So if these types of waste, agricultural waste and tannery waste are mixing, you have the possibility of the creation of more harmful chromium-6 in that wastewater that then enters the environment. So in terms of the impact of chromium-6 on humans, studies have shown that chromium-6 inhibits plant photosynthesis and stunts growth. And though humans and animals can detoxify chromium-6 to the less toxic chromium-3, in the process, our bodies are at risk of mutagenic damage. This is because in the course of the reaction to turn chromium-6 into chromium-3, sometimes there are intermediate compounds created, like free radicals and other negative compounds that can actually attack the DNA, proteins, and membrane lipids of our body's cells. And this can lead to impairment of cellular function or even lasting mutations. So over time, if humans or animals are being chronically exposed to chromium-6, this can increase the risk of certain cancers, particularly in body organs that are most likely to come in contact with chromium. So in oral exposure, if you drink water that is contaminated with chromium-6, or if you eat something, a plant or an animal that has been contaminated with chromium, then usually the organs that are most impacted are the liver, the kidneys, our GI or gastrointestinal system, and our immune systems. So populations of concern in the West Bank that could potentially be exposed to chromium-6 include Palestinians and Bedouins living in the West Bank that live downstream of the pollution sites where tanneries discharge their wastewater. There's also a potential contamination of drinking wells in the area due to the seasonal flooding that occurs during the winter time. So these two aspects were things that I wanted to address in my research, which I'll be getting into now. So, the main objectives of my research project were, first of all, to characterize the overall level of chromium in the Hebron stream, just in general and also by seasons. So we wanted to see if the seasonal flooding and the rainy seasons make a difference in terms of the concentration of chromium in the water. We also wanted to try and observe the presence of chromium-6 specifically, as this is the major contaminant, chromium contaminant that we're concerned with because of its impacts to living organisms. And then finally, we wanted to see if we could establish a potential exposure pathway to chromium-6 among human populations living in the area, specifically Palestinians and Bedouins living in the West Bank. So first, we devised a research plan, and this includes several components. First, we wanted to sample the stream by season. So we wanted to sample before the rainy season, during the rainy season, and after the rainy season. We also wanted to collect water samples, sediment samples, plant and goat sheep tissue as well. The reason why we wanted to collect the plant samples is because this represents the transfer of chromium through the exposure pathway to humans. So if there's chromium in the water or in the sediment, if plants are growing near the stream, they could take up the chromium from the water or the sediment. And then those plants can be eaten by goats or sheep in the area that are raised and then sold to the meat industry in towns and cities around the West Bank. And if those goats and sheep are eating plants with chromium, potentially they could absorb that chromium as well. And so when people eat those goats or sheep, then that is the way that humans can be potentially exposed. So this was the exposure pathway we wanted to try and identify. We also wanted to look at the difference in chromium levels in the stream water versus well water in the area to see if there was actually contamination occurring from the stream. And then finally, we wanted to test both in the West Bank and in Israel to see if the treatment of the wastewater in the stream, once it crosses the green line into the Israeli side, was actually effective in removing a significant amount of the chromium from the water. So after doing all this sampling, to find all of this information out, we needed to do several different analyses. First was to analyze the total chromium in all of the samples, then was to analyze the chromium-6 in samples. And then again, to look at the difference between well water and stream water, the difference between water from the Israeli side and water from the Palestinian side, and then also to try and examine how concentration of chromium was changing from water to plants to goat and sheep tissue to see if an exposure pathway was possible among humans. So currently, we have already selected our sampling sites. You can see some pictures here on the left. These are specific sites we have chosen along the stream. And here on the right side, we have a map that was created by Younes. And so in the green squares are the areas along the stream where we are sampling from. So this is just to give you some context. And then basically to the south, you can see Meitar, and this is an Israeli city, and very close to here is where the Shilkit treatment plant is located. And then right around in this area also is our point of sampling on the Israeli side. So we also have already done one round of sampling and analysis. And so the results from this round of sampling, we found that in fact, there is no chromium detected in water from the wells. This is great news because it means that likely the risk of contamination of drinking wells in the area by water from the stream is very low. So this potential route of exposure to chromium-6 among the populations in the area is unlikely based on the results that we have found. The other thing that we discovered is that the amount of chromium in water collected from the stream in the West Bank is higher from that collected from the stream from the Israeli side. And we also found the same pattern in plant samples taken from both the West Bank and in Israel. So this is an indication that treatment of the water at the Shilkit water treatment plant is effective in removing a good amount of the chromium from the water. Finally, we also found that the total amount of chromium in water samples is higher when measured with sediment included in the water versus when we filter the sediment out of the water before measuring the chromium. This indicates that sediment is a major sink for the absorption of any chromium in the wastewater that's in the stream. So the presence of chromium in the sediment has important implications for the potential of plant uptake. And this result actually led us to decide that we want to be a bit more robust with our sampling of plants and to look at specific species and try to be consistent in taking the same species from each site to understand how different plant species absorb the chromium, whether or not they metabolize them, and whether if they grow next to the stream or further away from the stream, there's a difference in the level of chromium that they're absorbing from the soil. And so now we're currently in progress with sampling round 2, and we've done the samples for round 2 and are now fulfilling the analysis portion. So we collected water, plant, and sediment samples during this round. And we also took measures in the field, including the pH, dissolved oxygen, and temperature of the water samples. Now for the analysis this round, we again are looking for total chromium content in all of our samples. And we're also trying to, again, find the amount of chromium-6 we have in samples. In the previous sampling round, we were still refining our analysis process to determine the level of chromium-6 specifically, because it's quite hard to differentiate between chromium-6 and chromium-3 with analytical methods because they're so similar to each other. So this is where we are currently. You can see on the left, these are some samples of the plants that we took from the field and will be analyzing in the lab. And so finally, our next steps are to finish the round 2 analysis, and based on what we find, we'll more precisely plan round 3 of sampling and analysis in the springtime or the summer. Now, round 2 will be important because if we find significant levels of chromium-6 in plants, then it means we have enough of a reason to actually harvest goat or sheep tissue to continue examining the exposure pathway from the water to humans in terms of exposure to chromium-6. If we don't find a high level of chromium-6 in the plants, then we might decide not to sample from goat or sheep tissue, as this is an indication that perhaps this exposure pathway is not necessarily strong. So yeah, hopefully we'll have the results of round 2 analysis in the next couple of weeks, and then we will continue with our research. So just to end, I want to make some final thoughts about, I guess, my project and how it relates to the topic of transboundary water that we've been discussing today. First, I think that my project and the issue it addresses demonstrate that water pollution really does not recognize political boundaries. And this also goes in hand with the fact that transboundary water really requires collaborative management if problems are to be properly and lastingly addressed. I also think that the project shows that upstream actions have downstream consequences, and that always you must consider the other riparians or the other users of water resources when you decide to make changes in a watershed that you share with others. And then finally, I think, and what I hope comes ultimately from doing this research is raising awareness about this particular issue in the Hebron watershed, as I think that this is a very important strategy for addressing environmental problems and to encourage public discourse that will hopefully result in collaboration and finding solutions for problems like this. So with that, I would like to say thank you. And I really look forward to discussing any questions you have at the end of this session.
Great. Thanks, Olivia, for sharing your interesting research and the scary thought about chromium not only being in the stream, but actually maybe making it all the way to the food web, both for all organisms and all the way to humans eating all those organisms. So hopefully collaboration will resolve this problem sooner rather than later. So thanks again. We're moving on, and now we have our colleague Farid, who will be talking to us about the research they've been doing, very relevant regarding COVID-19 and detecting COVID-19 in the waters. So Farid, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Masawan. Good evening, everybody. So our final project, this session is about actually new methods of detecting the residues, the genetic residues, the RNA residues of the SARS-CoV-19 virus, which is called in our colloquial word, corona. So you can see here, like this is one of the first picture taken of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And if like, it's really ironic, 1 year ago, if I would have asked you, what is corona? For you who knows Latin will tell me that's a crown. Mm-hmm. For you who are Scandinavic or live in Scandinavia will tell me that's our like national currency. For you who are coming from more physiology will say, oh, that's like the coronary artery which feeds the heart. For you who in the agriculture sector will tell me that's like the big machine that ploughs the earth. And for you who loves beers will tell me that's like, that is like the beer from Mexico, Becky here will relate to. But now, if I tell you what's corona, nobody will tell me any of those. Everybody will tell me this is the corona. So first of all, I will have to say, corona is not a new virus. Like it's a little bit misleading. I will not elaborate because corona, it's a family of viruses. So we're actually relating to a specific new novel discovered virus, SARS-CoV-2, which is severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus. It causes COVID-19, that's the diseases. And it's part of the corona family, like the SARS, like the MERS. So it is not a novel family, but we have now a new member. And this member is mutating like most of that family because they are RNA-based viruses. So I will elaborate a little bit. It's like the flu. Most of the RNA viruses have genetic material, which is RNA. So when they infect the cell host, they use reverse transcriptase enzyme to reverse the RNA and to duplicate it into DNA. In this reversing process, a lot of mistakes happen. And this gives those viruses their mutation ability and the immunity from our immune system. And unfortunately, that's why we need to get vaccination every year. So why is screening for the SARS-CoV-2 virus in the wastewater system? I will just give you a small example. Do you see this chart? I copied this chart from the Israeli Health Ministry website. It shows the detection of the corona, the SARS-CoV-2 virus in the Bedouin population in 4 villages. El Sayed, semi-recognized village, Tal Sheba, Tal Sabi, Hura, and Laqiya. Those are recognized villages. So just one example. If you look at Tal Sabi, which is a town of 33,000 inhabitants, like you could see that there's no detail. It's almost like zero, like you'd see in the same in El Sayed. And you could like think, are those numbers logical? Do they reflect the reality on the ground? A lot of you are thinking, nodding their heads and thinking those numbers are detached from reality. Well, those numbers are the official numbers from the official and formal, let's say, detection methods for the SARS-CoV-2, which is using a serological test and using the nasal test, which requires people to come to the clinic and do the testing there. So why doing surveillance for the SARS-CoV-2 virus in wastewater? Well, the first reason is that most of the people don't know that they have the virus. The problem with the SARS-CoV-2, most of the carriers are asymptomatic. So they do what's like this phenomenon called silent community transition. It's not their fault. They simply don't know it. Most of us will not experience the severe symptoms of the virus. So this is a problem. If you're asymptomatic, there's no reason for you to go to the clinic to do the testing. The other issue is under-testing. So this actually relates to the Bedouin community and to the Haredi community in Israel and to the Arab community. For a lot of reasons, in this community, there is under-testing. Why is that? First of all, in the Bedouin community, especially in the unrecognized villages, there's lack of access to healthcare services. A lot of the unrecognized villages don't even get like road access. So either they need to go to the next big city, or they need to go to the next Bedouin recognized village to go to the clinic. The second reason is lack of trust between the population, the inhabitants of those villages and the government. There is this political conflict, which sometimes spill into, unfortunately, the epidemiological aspect of the relation between the Ministry of Health and the population. And also there's the stigma, like in conservative, let's say family-based societies, like our society, Palestinians and Arab societies, if somebody will knows, like if you got positive, so like the word will spread and a lot of people will feel shame, and they just simply would rather to sweep it under the carpet than go and do the testing. You know, what happens if my neighbor's uncle saw me and he told his wife and she told whatever who, and then like it's gonna spread like the virus itself among the community. And this is what it's gonna cause community shaming. So also we have misinformation regarding SARS-CoV-2. And we could still see this misinformation also on this conspiracy theories in the vaccination efforts amongst those communities. So we said there is the asymptomatic aspect, there is the under-testing, and it's very important also why we should do a surveillance using wastewater is the specificity with high resolution upstream detection. I will explain. Let's say now in Israel, the problem with the spreading of the corona was that there are certain cities that have high concentration of corona, especially the Haredi. Haredi is like ultra-Orthodox Jewish community, like in Bnei Brak, and also amongst the Arab population. So what did the state do is actually do a national lockdown. So these methods were first implemented in Holland by the Dutch. And they said, listen, Amsterdam, instead of closing all of Amsterdam, let's see, first of all, if we detect the virus residues, primers in the wastewater, then we know for sure it's there. Then we're going to go upstream. Let's look for neighborhoods. What they do, they look for the end discharge point for every sewer wastewater system. If they detect at this neighborhood the residues of the virus, they will simply shut that neighborhood, not shut all of Amsterdam. The same logic we would love to apply here. Unfortunately, it did not go smoothly or even well in Israel. We have what's called the traffic light method to try to know which town to close or not. But it did not work very well here. It was very chaotic. So imagine if we could use these methods in trying to detect for the SARS-CoV-2 residues without causing panic, without causing mistrust, even without bothering the community. And the work is very covert, like we're not that visible. And we could communicate with that community without the stigma. And we could also be very specific. So our project has 3 phases. We already finished phase 1. So the phase 1 project was actually about detecting the residues of the genetic primers, the RNA primers of the coronavirus, of the SARS-CoV-2 virus exerted in the digestive system in the Hebron River basin. So as Younes and Olivia explained, Hebron River stems from the city of Hebron, it continues through the Palestine, West Bank, then enters Israel. So it enters Israel after the checkpoint, the West Bank checkpoint. You could see it here in the Mitar, where Clives live. There's the catchment facility. This catchment facility actually has been established by Israel so that it could clean the Hebron stream water from the slurry and the sludge of the stone industry in the West Bank in Hebron. In Hebron, they have a flourishing stone industry, and all of the waste is being discharged into the river. So the Hebron River actually is a very unique case because it's actually been polluted by wastewater, like human effluents, by industrial effluents, and like by also plants with the olive sludge, and also with the corpse of animals being thrown there. So it's a mix of everything. So you could see the blue line, and thanks to Younes, this map was done by Younes. You could see it like we're entering the West Bank catchment facility. Here, this is the first point that the Hebron River enters Israel. The water is being cleaned off the sludge and slurry of the stone industry. Then it continued through Mitar, and then it continued until it reached the Shoki treatment facility here. From the Shoki treatment facility, it's like a central station to purify and to treat water from all the Bedouin and Jewish villages around. So you could see Laqiya, you could see Hura, and you could see Mitar. And also there are some semi-recognized villages. When I say semi-recognized, those are villages that are actually on the map, but they still don't have infrastructure, sewer infrastructure. There are also totally unrecognized villages where they actually don't have any kind of recognition or any official representation with the state of Israel. So we have an issue here. So if you were actually unrecognized, as Olivia and Younes said, you're gonna discharge the effluents in the cesspit and also in the river. So what the community actually do, if in the unrecognized villages, you could see that they're gonna discharge the effluents in the river. And then it will continue to Umbatin semi-recognized village, and then it will continue to Omer until it reaches Bir Sabah, Beersheba. So what we actually were thinking about doing is trying to detect and give novel methods to detecting the SARS-CoV-2 virus, especially in those very marginalized community. So in Israel, we'll give you a picture. Like there's the center, it's called like Gush Dan, Tel Aviv, and it's metropolitan. This is the center. And there's the periphery, which is usually the Negev, and the Nakab, and the Jalil. So in those periphery, there's also marginalized community. The unrecognized Bedouin villages are the marginalized community of the periphery of Israel. And unfortunately, there's no proper, I think, service for this community. And this is where the Arab Institute comes and fills this gap. This gap should be filled by the Israeli Ministry of Health. And they're actually piloting several projects in large cities, but they're not piloting it in those communities. So this is where we actually come in and doing this very important job. So we thought we're gonna do grab sample, I'm gonna explain later, and we're gonna focus on several Bedouin villages. So we focused on Laqiya, you could see it here. We focused on Hura, and we focused on Umbatin, and we focused on the West Bank sewage catchment facility. Why did we do that? We actually, Hura and Laqiya are recognized villages. So we can actually test from the sewer grid, from the sewer system. Umbatin is semi-recognized, does not have a sewer system, but actually discharge the effluents in the stream of the Hebron River. And the catchment facility will give us like an indication of what's happening in the West Bank, in the whole of the West Bank. So if you could see, we did take samples. We did take samples from Hura, from Laqiya, from the West Bank, from Batin, also from Sayed and Tel Sabah. We did different kind of analysis, I'll explain later, but we wanted to give a holistic and comprehensive picture of the spread of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, of the Corona-19 disease among those communities. So do you remember when I said we're gonna use the upstream method? So this is a master plan, infrastructure master plan of Hura. And you could see here, those red lines are the infrastructure system, the sewer infrastructure system. So if we could look for the end discharge point for every neighborhood, we could actually, this is our dream, detect the situation in every neighborhood. And it's very interesting because in the Bedouin and Arab society, usually the same clan and family live in the same neighborhood. So you could easily there isolate, let's say, the infected community. So what did we do? First of all, we did grab sample. Grab sample, just snapshot sample. You go there and you take what's there and you give it for analysis. So we took from a manhole, from end discharge point sewer system, from open river sources like the one that you see on the right. And after we took the grab samples, we sent them for analysis. We took grab samples from Hura, Laqiya, from the West Bank catchment facility, from also Sayed, and from Tel Sabah. It's easily done, and it needs less logistic. That's why also we wanted to do as much as possible, but it's less credible than composite sampling. Composite sampling it's an automatic sampling methods where a sampler, the one that you see, which actually is a courtesy of the Can-Do company, actually sample for one full day, several samples from the source. So you give him instruction, for example, to sample every half an hour for one full day from the source that you're interested in. So this Can-Do sampler was installed in 3 points: in Hura, in Shoket, which the Lakiye end discharge point goes there, and also in the catchment facility. And this is the gold standard in the sampling procedure, because it gives you a full picture of what's happening on that day. And we chose Saturday. We chose Saturday because Saturday is the holiday day. It's like everybody is sitting. Usually, even in Israel and Palestine, people don't work on Saturday. So we thought it's gonna give us a more credible picture of the situation on the ground. So if we did the sampling on Sunday, most of the people will head to work. So it's gonna be less reflective of reality. And what's cool about the Can-Do sampler, it's all automatic. Like you could see the website, where they have a website. I can go there and I give virtual instruction online. Like I can give the sample orders to do the sampling right now. I could change it, like everything through the computer. And we did stretch it, the capability of that sampler to the end. You could see here, this is the Shoket facility. And this huge bunker, like open well, it's at the end discharge point of Lakiye. And it was very difficult pumping because it's anti-gravitational. And I will tell you, I think this is the first time that those sampling methods were used, because most of our sampling was like above the ground. So it needed a lot of, recalibration. So another interesting aspect of our project was the Hebron River sampling. We're one of the few who actually did take samples from natural open stream. Most of like the sampling processes do sampling in sewer system, in gridded communities. So we, like the novel part of our project that we take from open source. And this is me and Clive in Umbatin, the village that you have seen. We're taking their samples from the open river. So what's next? After we take the sample, we send them to the labs where there are 2 methods of extraction for the DNA. One's called Dialysis Filter, the first, where like there's like this filter which is used from the dialysis machine to filter the water and isolate the virus genetic primers. And the second one is called centrifugal device filters. After they extract the genetic primers, they use the RT-PCR machine, which detects and give a picture of the concentration of the virus there. So this is the machine. And you could see here, those are the results. We looked for 3 primers, the N2 and the N3. I'm not going to elaborate, but I'm going to give like the summary results. You could see here, there is a concentrated versus raw in Hura, Lakiya, and the West Bank. And I will explain a little bit. So every sample that we take, first of all, we do the analysis for the raw, like the one we took from the actual site, and then we compare it to the samples after we did the filtration. And also we did comparison between the 2 methods, between the dialysis filtration process and the centrifugal filtration process. And we did get actually a nice correlation between the 2 methods, which is good, which is actually give more credibility to our findings. And our holy grail is to give some kind of correlation between the concentration of the virus and the percentage or the numbers of the virus carriers. This is like still in the process, on a global effort, the process of finding this golden standard model. It's still not yet there. There are some tentative models, but we don't have a model which will correlate the concentration of the virus found in the wastewater with the number of carriers. So we're trying to do some experimentary methods in trying to detect some kind of correlation in order to give the Ministry of Health indication of the real situation on the ground. So, just a sec. Phase 2. after finishing phase 1, we are going to we actually now we're doing it with the help of Younes. We went to the West Bank, and it's actually now becoming a transboundary project. Now we're going to the west part of the Hebron Stream, where Olivia and Younes show you the map of the Hebron River. So in the Palestinian Authority, also because of occupation, because of lack of resources, because of a lot of constraints, the situation, the health services there are very, like they're not in the best shape. Let's say in Israel, for example, they have very good health services. So we're trying to relate to this issue and to the problem of detection by doing the same process there. And we're actually more interested in the Hebron area. And I will just show you like a small example. This is like the numbers at the end of 2020. Now we're seeing an outbreak in the Palestinian cities and villages, and those are actually not representative. So that's why it's very important now that we do our work to give a clear picture of the real situation of the virus morbidity on the ground. So you can see here now, this is like the numbers from the Palestinian Ministry of Health. Those are the numbers in Hebron. So look, Hebron is the largest Palestinian city in the West Bank. And what you're seeing here, that it's actually have only 448. And I doubt those numbers, like I think I've questioned the Israeli Health Ministry data, because I think the facts on the grounds are bigger, and that's why we need to do this research. So we actually focusing on two parts. The first one, we're focusing on Hebron city, which actually has a sewer infrastructure. And the second part is we're trying to sample from the open stream river from the Palestinian villages. So I'll give you also an example, as Olivia and Younes said, most of the West Bank communities live on off-grid community. They don't have sewer system, and everything is being discharged in the river. So you could see here, this is Hebron, the purple one, this is the industrial area, and this is the place where we're gonna hopefully do the composite sampling with the automatic sampler. And also we're gonna do two graph sample, one in Al Fawar refugee camp, and the other one is downstream in Rabboud. Yeah, you can see it here, but it's downstream where also we took samples with Olivia for the Chromium project. So this was the first, let's say, initial tentative graph sampling analysis from the West Bank. You could see here, like there is detection of the virus. And this is with higher resolution from the catchment facility, because in the catchment facility, it's mixed wastewater from the settlements, from the Palestinian community, from the industrial area. This one is actually very, very specific. It should give us like an isolated sample for that specific place. And very interesting finding, again, it's tentative. We're actually seeing their high concentration of the British mutation of the virus. And it's interesting to see how this mutation is spreading. So after finishing phase 2, we're looking forward for phase 3. Phase 3, this is like the final goal destination, is trying to find a way to try to screen wastewater for detection of the SARS-CoV-2 virus in the Gaza Strip. So I would love to thank you from me and all of the CTWM team. Thank you so much. I would love to hear the questions at the last part. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Farid. Thank you so much for enlightening us about all your efforts trying to control this awful disease. The plan is, we know that we're a little bit later, now it's at 2:34. So we know that some of you may have to leave, and we apologize for that. But if you can stay a little longer, what we would like to do is continue. We have a lot of really good questions. And if you need to leave, don't worry about it. All of this is going to be recorded. And so you can, listen to this later on and see the video, the Zoom video later on. We will post it and we'll give you the link so that you can see it. So if you can stay with us, wonderful. And if you can't because time is off for you, then it's fine. We will share with you later on all that information. So we're going to open this as a question and answer kind of a forum where we'll have the 4 speakers of today's session around. And Frances is going to be reading some of the wonderful questions that she says she's received. And then she's going to direct that question to a particular speaker. So thanks again, everyone, for being with us. We really appreciate your time. Frances, you have the questions?
Yeah, thank you, Becky. So our first question is for Olivia. How do Palestinians in the West Bank feel about the pollution in the stream, the Hebron Stream?
Well, okay, so I can really only speak to you know, the Palestinians that I've interacted with. So this is just based on a few conversations that we had with people that we met when we were out sampling, that were graciously translated by Farid and or Younes. So from our field visits, what we've sort of learned from talking to locals is that they are very aware of the issue of pollution in the stream. And of course, they're not happy with it. But the stream has been polluted by wastewater for many decades, but at this point. And from what we've heard from locals, it seems like there have been attempts in the past to try to bring this issue to authorities or to municipal leaders to try to do something about it. But it doesn't seem like any lasting solutions have been implemented. So I think, of course, people are aware, and they try to stay away from the stream. They say that sometimes, you know, if you interact with the stream or the water, sometimes they feel like they have respiratory problems or they get sick if they somehow ingest the water, and the smell can be bothersome. So yeah, I think that's the general consensus. They know that it's a problem, but it's, I think unfortunately, they feel like they've had to accept it as sort of a fact of the stream's existence.
Thank you. Another question is from Gregory, not for anyone in particular, but how deep does the well have to be to access groundwater aquifers? Maybe that's a good question for Clive.
Yeah, I can answer that, but if you allow me, just Francis, I just want to say a very, very big thank you to Farid and to Olivia and to Younes. You make me feel very proud. You guys are doing excellent work, and you all did amazing presentations. So I just want to say on behalf of myself, pleasure to work with you guys, and amazing work going forward. In terms of the question, so in the mountain aquifer system, actually there can be very deep wells. There are wells that could go about on average 600 meters, and even deeper. The water is actually very good quality, and so that's why there's a lot of concern about any type of pollution. There's high porosity in the geological layer, so pollution as much as good quality rainwater can enter into the aquifer. So it's pretty deep in general. The coastal aquifer, on the other hand, is quite a shallow aquifer system, given its proximity to the shoreline with the Mediterranean.
Okay, thank you. Another question is from Rasha for Clive. What is the mechanism that Israel applies to get the costs for wastewater treatment from Palestinian communities along the Green Line?
So that is actually also part of the work that we're doing. There unfortunately is a very non-transparent mechanism that was agreed to under the Oslo Accords, which is the Israeli Finance Ministry collects on behalf of the Palestinian Authority tax revenues owed to the Palestinians. In the case of water, this was already mentioned, I think Olivia mentioned it, Israel applies the polluter pays principle to wastewater discharges into the environment, and they apply this principle unilaterally to the Palestinians. So the Palestinians are polluting the wastewater, they're polluting the surface water, and that water is crossing into Israel. And therefore, the polluter pays principle in this instance is the Palestinians or the polluter, they need to pay because Israel is required under its own environmental laws to do the cost of cleanup. And that relates to the infrastructure of the catchment facility on the border of the Green Line, which Farid mentioned. The cost of that catchment facility is actually paid for by the Palestinians as a deduction from their tax revenues on an annual basis. The problem is that is done in a unilateral manner with no transparency by Israel. So basically the Palestinians just get a bill every year that says this is the cost treatment of untreated wastewater coming out of the West Bank. The cost is in the millions of shekels every year, and that cost is rising because the amount of wastewater is increasing, mostly because of the population. One of the real issues, and where there's a lot of frustration on the Palestinian side, is that there's no differentiation in terms of whether or not that cost also includes settlement sewage. There are many settlements in the West Bank that are also discharging their wastewater into the environment. And so the Palestinians say, well, hang on a second, are we also paying for the treatment of settlement sewage as well? So because there is no yet overarching mechanism for a bilateral agreement, we have a very inefficient and a very one-sided mechanism. One of the things that we're trying to do within the Arab Institute in terms of the transboundary work is to explore how to develop a mutually agreed on bilateral sewer monitoring protocol. This is one area of work that we're trying to move forward.
Thank you. Another question is for Farid from Mary Grace. In what ways do Israelis and Palestinians work together on environmental concerns? And is there an overflow into political collaboration for peace?
As just Clive has said, it all stems from the Oslo Accords. And unfortunately, in normal time, you should have two committees. One is the Palestinian Water Community and the other is the Israeli Water Committee, and they should sit together and decide on the process. But this is unfortunately not the fact on the ground. Fact on the ground, because of the political situation, there's actually no dialogue, and there is this stalemate. And also what complicates the matter further is the fragmentation of the West Bank. You have Area A, Area B, Area C, and every area has own jurisdiction. So for example, in Area C, it's like the Israeli occupation forces who are actually in control. In Area A, it's the Palestinian community. In Area B, it's like security provided, controlled by the Israeli, and the civil administration by the Palestinians. So actually, it's very complicated. Unfortunately, we're not seeing this transboundary collaboration between the two authorities because of the political situation. And here, I think the importance of our work, the Arava, of the Damour, of a lot of NGO that actually trying to improve the situation on the ground from grassroots movement from downstream to upstream. We're trying to work with the local community, with the simple people on the ground, trying to reach out to this community. And after reaching out, trying to reach out to the authorities, like in the Palestinian authorities and the Israeli authorities.
Farid, if I might add, we are now forming a center for applied environmental diplomacy to sort of take this on the ground work that Farid has talked about and make it into something more widely applicable, both in the region, but also globally. Because we feel like if we can do it for Israel and Palestine, we probably can do it for Canada and the United States, or Texas and Mexico, or any of the millions of places where environmental issues become diplomatic issues.
Thank you, Farid and Miriam. Another question is, I think this might be for Younes or Olivia.
I just want to introduce Miriam. Miriam Fay is the head of the Fay Friends of the Arava in the United States. So just to know who is she.
Thank you. So this next question I think is for both Younes and Olivia, maybe Farid as well. What are some ways to identify upstream contamination risks in infrastructure sparse upstream regions in order to implement targeted research projects downstream? That's from Vijaya. We have to reword it. How do you identify upstream contamination risks in order to implement targeted research projects downstream?
Younes, would you like to reply? Because I think you're the GIS expert. You're the one who given us the map.
Yeah. First of all, our work, we will study first upstream and midstream and downstream. And unfortunately, in the West Bank, there is no there is absent the sewer network system in different villages or cities or in many areas. And I mean about the infrastructure of water sector or wastewater sector or street or road, it is so weak, and we haven't good infrastructure in the West Bank. Just the infrastructure in West Bank in the main city with the poor, it is poor. And when I mean it is very pure, because it is so old. I mean in Bethlehem or Al-Auja or in Hebron, 20 years or 15 years of infrastructures not get any maintenance until now. And if about the electricity also, we haven't the maintenance in the electricity of all of the West Bank, and the same way of the infrastructure about water and about waste.
Younes, you're accidentally muted. Ah, there we go.
Okay, because the situation in West Bank are so badly, the infrastructure, all of it is poor. That is it.
Another question is from Arella for Clive. Is there a way to potentially treat water polluted from nitrates?
Nitrate pollution is not too difficult to treat. The challenge really with all of the pollution that we're dealing with is really the fact that most of it is non-point source. In other words, it's very difficult for us to detect where it is exactly coming from. So in terms of nitrates and phosphates and similar chemicals, we know that this is pretty much due to fertilizers and pesticides from agriculture. And the West Bank is a heavily rural region. So the issue really is how to regulate this use at the source, therefore minimizing the discharge of the chemicals into the waste, into the water to begin with. So I would say to contextualize everything that we've been discussing with you guys today, probably one of the central issues here is the lack of infrastructure. And the fact that everything is so decentralized throughout the West Bank, as it is with the Bedouin in the Negev. So because it's so decentralized, it's almost impossible to identify where the pollution is coming from. And so I think that's the challenge. Until we find a comprehensive means of trying to minimize the discharge of any type of pollution into the environment at source, this kind of issue is going to escalate again, because as the population grows, and there is a relatively high population growth in the West Bank, this problem is going to get worse. So part of our work, and I'm pleased that Miriam mentioned the diplomacy work that we're doing, because that is an essential issue here. It's how do you bring the two parties together, because both recognize and acknowledge there's a problem. Nobody's denying that we have a real problem here. The challenge is how do we come together and find the best possible solution? And what we're offering at the RMI Institute is to try to bring the parties together and say, look, there's different ways to think about this. In certain areas, yes, you should improve and install centralized systems like in urban areas like the city of Hebron where already there's some sense of a sewer network, but there are huge areas around the West Bank where that's probably not the best solution. And therefore, how do you advocate and promote a decentralized solution? So it's really a mixed bag. It's a little bit of both. But at the end of the day, the parties involved have to come together and push these kinds of things forward. What we can do at the level of the nonprofit is to do case studies and pilots and to demonstrate the utility of what we're doing. But at the end of the day, the governments have to get involved as well, and the international community to promote these projects. And you know, we're optimistic, but we're also realistic. It's a process. It's going to take a long time. But I think a lot of the work that we're doing is really, you know, bringing to light some of the real challenges in terms of the level of pollution that's happening in the region.
Thank you. Another question is from Raviv for Olivia. It's probably too early to answer. I think you might have touched on this a little bit at the end of your presentation, but what type of solution could be implemented to tackle the issue of chromium pollution in the Hebron Stream?
Well, okay, so this is also kind of getting into what Clive was just saying about non-point source solutions. I mean, one of the problems of much of the industrial pollution is that we aren't exactly sure where specifically it's coming from. So I think the first step would be to really identify tanneries that are discharging their waste into the environment, and you know, I think then you'd have to try to do maybe a decentralized solution to try and work with them to change their methods of dealing with this wastewater. I mean, you could also try to go from a top-down approach and implement stricter regulations, but this regards this would involve, you know, many more actors. This would involve bureaucratic authorities, and that's very complicated and takes a long time. So a solution like that, while maybe a more lasting solution, it's definitely much more complicated to implement. So I think perhaps a better approach would be some sort of decentralized solution. Maybe if there were decentralized modular treatment facilities that you could install, similar to what Younes's work involves. So yeah, unfortunately, it's a complicated question with not very clear answers, but yeah, there's multiple ways you could address it.
Thank you. Younes, a question for you. What are the main sources of water in Al Uja village?
The main source of our village, one, the Israeli company, Mokorot. The second, Adauja River or Zerbering. And when I said Mekerot, it is an Israeli company, and the municipality, they were connected it by pipelines, and beside it depends under the boundary of the municipality of the area. About 80% are connected to the Mekerot by pipeline.
Okay. Thank you. I think we have time for 2 more questions. Sorry I didn't get the chance to, you know, spotlight anybody who wants to ask their questions out loud, but we got a lot from the chat. This is a question from Michael. I imagine could be for Farid and or Clive. How are the decentralized wastewater systems monitored?
Why would you go? Actually, we're working now on a project with the Bedouin community in the unrecognized villages, where we want to install an automatic decentralized water treating apparatus. It works on renewable energy. It can be controlled like the can-do sampler automatically from a software like via PC. So this is actually the new era. And as Clive said, the future is not only on centralized infrastructure, because most of the developing world does not have an infrastructure, and it costs millions to build those kind of infrastructure. So meanwhile, we could give a medium solution which actually could treat water, and they could use that water for agricultural use, and at the same time does not cost a lot of money and could be sustainable. Clive, you'd want to add something?
Thanks, Farid. Yeah, I'll just add that it's a very good question, because one of the most challenging aspects of decentralized wastewater treatment is water quality, especially when you are wanting to reuse that water in agriculture, as Farid said. So in parallel with the various off-grid technologies that we're piloting throughout the West Bank and Israel, and also, by the way, in Jordan, is also piloting a remote monitoring of the water quality, specifically on the effluent. We actually have another project that we're working on where we are developing an online portal that can connect to remote monitoring sensors installed in our systems, and can read the water quality on a regular interval, just like the CAN-DO technology where you have continuous sampling. This is just continuous monitoring. And then we gather that information and we can compare that information in real time to the water quality reuse standards. So Israel and Palestine have a water quality reuse standard, which is what the government uses to regulate wastewater treatment. And so we are now able to use through this portal, showing whether or not our decentralized systems are meeting the standard, so that we can show to the government, the regulator, whether or not we are in compliance or not. So this is still, we're still very much in an R&D phase, but this is where things are going, and there definitely is a lot of exciting new technologies coming up throughout the world, where decentralized environmental services, let's say in general, not just water, it could be energy as well, waste management, is becoming more possible because of the intersection of the treatment, the various treatment technologies, and the monitoring technologies as well. And a lot of this is being driven because of the huge advances in communication technologies, artificial intelligence, and so on. So it's quite an exciting place to work. And I suppose we're taking a little piece of that in terms of pushing our agenda forward for off-grid water and wastewater services.
Okay, thank you. I have one last question from Drew, who I think is a future student, perhaps. I guess this is for Olivia. Sorry. And then I'll give it to Farid to wrap up. Oh no, I lost it. Okay, here's the question. Could the byproducts of other industries, calcium or olive oil production byproducts, be used to absorb chromium out of wastewater for treatment?
That's actually a really interesting question, and also quite an innovative way of maybe dealing with both types of waste. Specifically for calcium carbonate and olive oil sludge, I'm not entirely sure how they would react with chromium, whether they would convert one form of chromium to the other. But based on what I do know, lots of organic compounds and different heavy metals tends to convert chromium-6 to chromium-3. So, for example, the waste from the olive oil production industry, it could indeed react with chromium-6 and convert it to the less toxic chromium-3. Again, I mean, I'm just conjecturing here. I don't know for sure, but it is possible that could be a way of addressing the issue of chromium-6 pollution, and also getting further use out of a waste stream that otherwise would just be discharged without added the value. So that's a great question.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for sending in these really great questions. Thank you to Olivia, Clive, and Younes. I'll pass it on to Farid now to give his closing remarks.
Thank you so much. Shukran jazilan and tudaraba. where there is water, there is life. This is a villain from the Torah and from all, I think, the collective folklore of nations around the globe. And despite the fact that we're facing a lot of challenges, and I know some of the cynics will say, what you actually could do and change, you're like a small group of people, you're naive, happy-go-lucky. But from my experience, from my modest work on the ground with those amazing partners, this is how you do change. Instead of waiting for the change, waiting for the government, no, you should do the change on the ground. And every day I have this discussion with Clive and Younes and with Olivia, why we're doing this. And we keep reminding ourselves, because this is how you build the future bridge, not only for transboundary environmental and epidemiological cooperation, but hopefully, inshallah, Be'ezat Hashem, for peace cooperation. This is how you build a bridge between people. And at the end of the day, the motto of the Arava is, nature knows no border. My motto is, pollution knows no border. So if you want to tackle the problem, you should think locally, globally, and globally. And this is how you bridge the gap, by doing this kind of work. So guys, I'm really grateful for you staying up half an hour. Wow, that's amazing, like superheroes. But we're building our interactive community. If you're interested in collaborating, cooperating with us, please don't hesitate to reach all of us, me, Clive, Younes, Olivia, Miriam, Francis, and we're here to cooperate. We want to build this, as Miriam said, not only transboundary Palestinian-Israeli bridge to bridge the gap, but a global bridge. So we want to think on a global scale. So please don't hesitate to be in touch with us in order to think about future collaboration. Thank you so much. And I wish all of you a happy weekend in case in the United States, and a productive and calm week in the Middle East. Thank you so much. See you in our next week in our 4th session. And please don't forget to fill the feedback form link that Franny has sent. It's very important. We learned a lot through your important feedback, and looking forward to see you on our 4th session. See you all. Bye-bye. إلى اللقاء.
Bye.
Bye.